Only You. Have a special show for you today. Of course, Dr. Patino in his office and Juan Pablo de Leon, who has been joining us, Mr. Teacher Man, who also has his own podcast. We're going to be talking today about adolescence and the impediments to learning. And prior to the show, I'm listening to the two of you talk, and kind of interesting that Dr. Patino, you tend to deal with the most extreme issues when it comes to adolescence and mental health. Juan Pablo, you're with the quote unquote normal kids, and a couple of years back, I got to teach myself for at-risk kids, and the impediments to learning with them was very interesting. Usually, it was more social. It was prison. It was violence. It was their home life. So, of the three of us, we have the full extremes somewhere in the middle, and then you teach dealing with the quote-unquote normal kids. What does it look like on your end of it? How do we, our educational system, you as a teacher inside the room, identify these things so that some action can be taken so they don't end up in a school like where I taught or in the hospital where Dr. Patino is?
Yeah, with kids who are, experiencing difficulty in school, it often, like Dr. Patino always says, we have to look at the movie, the whole picture of the kid, right? And oftentimes, um, I find that it's a lack of stability education wise, where maybe they had to switch schools a lot. That happens a lot with kids who end up maybe having to go to some alternative school like where you taught. Um, I think kids in general respond really well to stability, where they go to their neighborhood elementary school that feeds into their neighborhood middle school and high school and so forth. And they even you see it even in low income schools or low achieving schools, schools that are in rougher neighborhoods. If it's a unified school district where the kid has specificity in curriculum and philosophy all throughout, you still see a lot of kids, for lack of better terms, pull themselves up by their bootstraps and achieve great things. So I would have to say that in conjunction with, you know, uh, domestic issues, I think causes a lot of, quote unquote normal kids, maybe kids who don't have the pathological issues that they wouldn't go see Dr. Patino. I think that's what causes those types of kids to end up uh, falling off the rails, uh, more or less.
Do you feel? And I'll get back to that in a minute. But as you were talking, I was thinking, if you feel that this movement toward individualizing is getting so extreme that we forget the group, right?
I personally haven't seen that in my educational experience. I think that school, if you look at, when I was in college, I took a class called um, School in the Movies, right? And as teaching education majors, we watched a bunch of movies that took place in schools, right? We watched Freedom Riders and Lean on Me, all those types of movies. And if you look at schools, say in the 1970s to the 1990s, not a big change. 1990s to the early 2000s, not a big change. I mean, schools change philosophies and change curriculums and things like that, but the system in itself hasn't changed very much. It is very cookie cutter. It is one size, supposed to be one size fits all. And I think we do our best to individualize things, but I'm not sure that large public schools actually accomplish that.
And when you're dealing with dysfunction, because every teacher has to deal with some degree of dysfunction. And we were talking before the program about what's normal, what's not normal. And in my business, we look more at balance, and adaptiveness than necessarily um, the kid being fit into a process. Okay, that if you fulfill these marks, then you're normal. Because any normal kid can become abnormal overnight, right? So, from my perspective, we have to be better at identifying who's at risk of dysfunctional behaviors. Let's not call it abnormal behaviors, but dysfunctional, that at the end of the day are dysfunctional to themselves. Because you see, There's nothing normal in being an adolescent. By definition, being an adolescent is a transitional state of separation from your parents and authority figures where you feel a little bit grandiose that you know everything, even though emotionally you're not mature enough to deal with rejection and criticism and things of that sort. So you haven't vacillated from being very mature intellectually, but then kind of immature emotionally, right? And that's kind of like the navigation that most average adaptive kids will have. Some discussion with their parents, trying to convince them they're right. Once in a while you mischievously do something, but it's not consistent all the time. So there's some expectations we have. But when things get too intense, too frequent, and cause too much dysfunction, let alone the pain they cause to other people, that's not good for them, right? And I wonder if when you get the kids in high school, have some of those kids been identified from elementary school as being kids that need some special attention, that need to be monitored closely? And I was mentioning to you before the program, kids with ADHD, kids with learning disabilities, kids with substance abuse, kids with significant domestic issues at home, uh, situations where they are the victims of domestic violence or abuse in other ways. So, does that become evident when the kids get to high school? Is there like a process by which you guys go and say, well, these kids are at more risk, they require a more specific intervention?
So you're talking about the kids who have not yet been identified.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So I like what you said last episode when you said, I think you said we raise our kids until what was it, 12 or 13? Right.
And then we contain them.
And then we contain them. Right.
Yeah.
So that's definitely what happens in high school. And when a kid has not been identified, they get to high school and they actually lose a lot of the accountability factors that were containing them, right? For example, in elementary school and middle school, if you're out at recess, there are certified teachers, or they call them supervisors, right? People on duty, right? Supervising recess, right? Where in high school, you have security guards. They're not necessarily supervising your behavior. They're dealing with the security of the school, right? So there's a accountability factor that's no longer there. Maybe your parents now let you stay out later. They let you hang out with a wider group of friends. They don't expect you home at a certain time. In high school, you don't just get passed along. In elementary school, at least here in Arizona, right? You don't have to pass sixth grade to go to seventh grade to go to eighth grade. You can get Fs from kindergarten through eighth grade, get to high school, and all of a sudden, if you don't pass freshman English, for example, you don't get to take sophomore English, where you have to take sophomore English and then also take freshman English at the same time. So when we see kids who have been in that process, sometimes I think teachers who have lost their hope will kind of throw their hands up and say, well, there's nothing I can do here, right? But if we see that there's a pathological issue, right, we there's a specific process to get those kids on an IEP. And I think a lot of teachers are really scared to go through that process because you're not allowed to call a parent and say, hey, I think your kid has ADHD. I would get him tested for ADHD, right? It is a lot of work to get this ball rolling. But yeah, there is a process. And I can go more into that if you'd like, to get a kid, whether it's on an IEP or the behavior plan, a 504 plan. We try our best to get those kids recognized and get them on it.
You see, when you navigate in the world that I do, where I see substance abuse, suicidal behavior, homicidal behavior, psychosis, disruptive behaviors resulting from exposure to drugs in utero or head injuries, I mean, all kinds of different things. You get a distorted picture of what the normal environment looks like. And part of I think that the challenge for us in my business is to understand what is the baseline we want to take a kid into, right? So if a kid comes to me with suicidal behavior, homicidal behavior, and their biological, psychological, and social issues, I have to establish a baseline of normalcy for that kid, right? And a level of functioning that would allow the kid to grow. Because at the end of the day, this is about growth. This is not just about learning, right? And there are a multitude of factors and the multitude of players. I mean, the teachers, the parents, the therapists, the psychologists, all kinds of people that are trying to contain and provide guidance into the how to, right? How do I go about handling this? Uh, but I wonder, because what I hear a lot with this from these kids in school is everybody dislikes me, everybody pushes me away, they think I'm weird. If I'm sad, I don't have anybody to talk to. There's an expectation that I have to be happy, and all those different things. And I wonder to what extent the normal high school environment is conducive to these kids' rehabilitation, right?
Mm.
I the difficult thing about that question, or about the confusion there, is that I see normal kids having the same thoughts, right? I coach wrestling, and I can't tell you how many of my wrestlers feel, and these are athletes who have a lot of friends, who they're friends with girls, they go to social functions. From the outside looking in, everything is normal, right? Like these kids, I mean, dang, you could probably hit them with a car and they'd survive. I mean, they look like superhumans, and when you sit down and you talk, I think that it's extra difficult, right? Because I think that's something that has to do with adolescence, is you gain this sort of pessimism, um, and it's normal and it's abnormal, right? Like when you see a kid socially trying their best, um, then I think that they're going to have negative thoughts at times, but they're not going to let it affect their behavior. When I see and I feel worried about a kid and their level of normality, is when it affects their behavior, right? So when I see a kid who is excluding themselves from their peers, where their peers aren't excluding them, I see it all the time, where kids are trying to include these kids, and these kids' body language, their face, the way they carry themselves physically, where they are on campus, they stay away from people because they think that um, people think of them negatively. But they've let this hatred and this anger or this angst boil up inside of them, and they're actually, digging themselves into a deeper hole. And to that, I usually tell kids, okay, if you walk from your parents' car to your classroom, right? How many negative interactions do you have in that time? Is it one? Is it two? Is it 10? Right? If it's 10, you're probably not the only kid, right? But I doubt that it's 10, even at a very, maybe at like a school with a lot of gang issues or things like that. But at your typical suburban public school, the majority of people are probably just keeping to themselves, right? And you're probably having no negative social interactions between your car to your classroom, between one classroom to the next, right? So when I see a kid trying their best, having those positive behaviors, I think that's a good thing. When a kid starts treating other people poorly, maybe starts fighting, maybe looks to drugs, looks to risky behaviors, starts acting disrespectful toward parents, that's when I say, okay, there's probably a deeper issue here. Are they dealing with some kind of trauma? Are they dealing with neglect at home, which you said earlier? Like, are they dealing with all these things that we see in kids who have reached your level of your office?
It sounds to me like what you're describing is a lower level of dysfunction than what obviously Dr. Patino sees,
Yeah.
suicidal behaviors and things like that. So, how in tune with their students are most teachers? Again, when I taught, we had very specific classes, very small, but average public high school now, you got tons of kids. I mean, as a person doing that as a living, how tuned in are you? Are you the exception, or are you the rule?
I think most teachers try their best, but there's a specific type of teacher who I think doesn't know their students. They're older, they're tuned out, they're closer to retirement. They didn't change, they didn't evolve with the profession. And so they've just gone deeper and deeper into this like almost hatred for their job. They hate their job, right? And they don't like kids. Um, unfortunately, the education system in itself encourages that type of teacher to stick around because it's much harder to be a teacher who cares about their kids, who invests time in getting to know them and build relationships with them. Because guess what's going to happen now? They're going to come to you with their problems, and you're going to have to be there for them. And that's a lot more difficult than saying, I'm a math teacher. I'm going to teach you math and that's it. And then at 2:30, I'm going to go home, right? Like that's way easier than the alternative, which is caring for your students. So you see it all. And I think at highly exceptional schools, you have more teachers who really care and they flock to those schools where, you have academic excellence, you have athletic excellence, excellence in performance and extracurriculars. And I think that those extracurricular activities are a part of our best defense against kids feeling poorly in school, kids dealing with any sort of pathological abnormality. When you have these giant extracurricular programs where kids can find community. I mean, we have at the school where I teach, we have one of the top e-gaming teams in the state. I think we won state for video games, right? So like when I was in school, if you stayed home and played video games every day, you were kind of a loser. Whereas now, like you could wear a Letterman jacket with a video game sticker on it,
That's awesome.
So yeah, but that probably doesn't happen at all schools, unfortunately.
Yeah, but what you're describing forces me to think that performance has been the consistent. Well, once you get to high school, performance is the self-esteem builder, right? Because I see a lot of kids that come back and say, "I'm not worth anything because I'm failing," right? And a lot of these kids already had issues with their self-esteem before, right? But if you don't care about performance until the 8th grade, and you go to high school and now performance is everything. So aren't you setting up the kids for failure to some degree?
I'm not necessarily talking about performance so much as I'm talking about finding a sense of community, right? Because obviously,
inclusivity, right?
Yeah. Because obviously, like my sport, the sport that I coach is super inclusive. Wrestling, it's non-cut, so you can just get on the team. We can't kick you off of the team unless you break an egregious rule, right? But it's non-cut. It's weight classes. You don't necessarily have to be super athletic to do it. You just have to be willing to work really hard, right? And have a decently good attitude. But not all extracurricular activities are based on performance. I mean, right now you see a lot of kids super comfortable with coming out as, LGBTQ plus, right? And we have that at a lot of campuses, especially since I started teaching. A lot of campuses have a Hispanic student union, a Black student union, an Asian student union. So you can join those clubs and just be, which I think is, I see a ton of kids do that and find their community, and they don't feel set up for failure because there is no expectation of them. It's just a social group that they can be a part of, where a lot of middle schools and elementary schools don't have the staff or the funding to provide those types of programs.
Okay, so the opportunity to find your niche is greater in the better schools, if you may, right?
Yeah. But I'm going to guess too, though, that a lot of your patients probably wouldn't seek that out, right?
Well, he gets a little complicated because when you were talking about socialization, you were talking about kids being very self-conscious. we need to understand that about 30% of the population has some degree of social anxiety, right? And that's something genetic. That's something you're born with, and you can see it in different kids that tend to be somewhat shy. They don't want to know new people. They have one or two friends, and they kind of hang out all the time. And most people with social anxiety will do okay, right? I mean, some of them will require treatment if it gets too dysfunctional. I mean, I see a lot of kids that during COVID decided I don't want to go back to the school. I'm going to stay online and so on. So there are more opportunities for kids to get disconnected from traditional school, right? I don't know if that's good or bad, but it is. That's what is happening. Uh, but it brings me back to the idea of a question that is extremely abstract, and is what is the purpose of school, right? I mean, what are you there for? Because from the time that I was there in high school in the 1970s till now, things have changed a lot. Expectations have changed, demands have changed. People have. Let me give you an example of. And I was just reading about this the other day and listening to the news about this, about a professor. This is in college, professor of organic chemistry at NYU, who was actually the author of all the texts on organic chemistry at NYU, right? So very well known, very well respected chemist, right? Then some parents started complaining about the fact that their children found the class too hard and they couldn't pass the class, right? And this is pre-med students, right? Because if you're going to go to pre-med, you have to do organic chemistry, right? So they filed some complaints with NAU about this particular teacher because nobody was passing his class because it was difficult. And guess what happened? NYU fired the teacher, right?
Yeah.
So I see this in terms of, because I also see young adults, 20, 21, 22, 25, that I've seen as adolescents, and I see them coming back from college for a number of different reasons, very demoralized. Because even if they did very well in high school, they find themselves unaided without the tools to make it in the real world, right? But what I found really interesting is that to see the parents advocating for the kids getting easier classes. Do you see that a lot in high school too?
Yeah. So there's a term in education called scaffolding, right? Which, literally a scaffold helps you get to a certain point, right? So scaffolding in education, can manifest itself in, you know, notes that are kind of pre-filled out for you. It's help. They're things that are there to help you succeed. And that's something that's consistent throughout K-12 education. There's scaffolding, there's help from teacher, there's all this. The help is and it's happening more and more, is built into the curriculum, right? A freshman needs a certain amount of help to write a 5-paragraph essay that a senior doesn't, but a senior still has scaffolding, right? In college, definitely in my experience as well, it is all removed. There is no scaffolding, right? There's the essay you have to write. Here's the information you have to know. Here's the test you have to pass. Do it. Create your own scaffolding,
Mhm.
right? So, yeah, it does become a sink or swim. And there are teachers who for sure have left this profession, especially teachers who were probably close to retirement, who had taught in a very specific way for a very long time. So what is the purpose of education? Is it to educate, or is it to weed kids out that we don't think can cut it, right? Both processes have shown to produce a number of very intelligent people, very successful people. So perhaps there's not an answer to that question. Me as a career educator, I think the goal of education is that your students learn and you do whatever it takes to help them learn. And failing a test shouldn't, you know, shouldn't stop them from being able to try again and try again until they get it, right? But what happens with a lot of professors is they're not career educators. They're masters of their subject. Perhaps they've never had any education training. They have a tremendous amount of experience, but their goal isn't to educate you. Their goal is to give you this information, put these expectations in front of you, and hopefully you've gotten the skills necessary to do it. And if you haven't, oh well, right? I definitely experienced that in college. But in high school, yeah, I've had teachers complain, oh, my kid didn't get the grade that he wanted. What can he do to do better? And my answer to that is they can do this. And 9 out of 10 times when I do that, the kid still doesn't do it because they have this helicopter parent advocating for them, and the student doesn't actually care. It's the parent who cares a lot. So yeah, that's a huge change in education. And one of the biggest changes is the administrative side of it. The administration at NYU did not back up their professor, right? That professor has put a tremendous amount of time and generated, I'm guessing, a tremendous amount of revenue for that university. And so for them not to back up that professor, I think sets a bad precedent. It's happened to me in education before where a kid does something wrong. I send them to the office and the office doesn't do anything about it. They don't back us up because they're more afraid of their parents than they are of the teachers, because they know that we need this job. We'll be here again tomorrow, right? That parent, especially with open enrollment in Arizona, that parent can say, you know what? I'm going to take my kid to the school down the street, right? Maybe they'll do whatever I tell them to do at the school down the street. Yeah, that's definitely a huge change.
Yeah, but basically you have parents pulling in one direction. I mean, helicopter parenting, still trying to manipulate the success of their children when their kids in reality want to be more free, but they're afraid of saying they want to be more free. And then you have teachers trying to figure out how to educate, and then you have the administrative structure of education who's more concerned about check marks, right? That things are
Revenue.
Well, yeah, I mean, at the end,
I
it's
mean, they got
revenue.
from the state. Even when I taught, a lot of the kids we got, it was. Correct me if I'm wrong, Juan Pablo. There's like a 90 days. Once they're in the first 90 days of school, that's when a lot of the public funding comes. After that, we'd get kids on day 91. They would kick them all out after they received the dollars for those kids' attendance.
Mhm. Well, I mean, it's not a purpose of our talk to fix the educational system,
Yeah.
but to understand that in order for things to be more functional, we need to some degree, be pulling in the same direction, right? And I think that sometimes we the direction we want to pull is the direction we want to go, not the direction we want our kids to go, right? So I always tell parents, when you start using yourself as the model you want your kids to follow, that gets a little problematic. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because you're unique the way you are, right? And in our business, even when we're dealing with substance abuse, when we're dealing with depression, anxiety, counseling, those kinds of things, we're always thinking in the context of the dichotomy. Is this lack of will or is lack of ability? Right? And how do you measure, is the kid unable or is the kid unwilling or is the kid a little bit of both? And then how come that's happening, right? Because very often, especially in substance abuse, kids are able, but they're not willing, right? And the reason they're not willing is very complex, biological, psychological, and social. But in education, it has become almost taboo to talk about ability, right? Like, is your kid really able to make it to high school? Now, we have this idea that everybody should be given the same opportunity, and I'm fine with that. But does everybody have the same ability, biologically, psychologically, and socially? And I'm not trying to separate groups, and I've been criticized for saying this before, but the reality is that we have to be willing to measure ability versus will. And I'm sure that you as a coach, you see some kids that are very willing but not very able,
Oh
and
yeah.
kids are not very willing but very able, and you try to struggle into how to balance that, right?
Yeah, it's
Yeah, I
how
mean
we get kids to perform, right? On all levels.
Yeah.
that's a constant question that gets asked, and you'll change your mind over and over about whether or not this kid can or should. Because sometimes that's another question. It's like, should this kid even be trying to do this? I see it a lot with like kids who want to play football, for example. I'm like, gosh, you're a freshman. Maybe you'll grow. You're 5'6". Maybe you'll grow, but maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you shouldn't play football because it's not what's best. It's not what's in your best interest, right? That's kind of a shallow example, but yeah, you've got skill, you've got will, and then you've got all these different forces pulling a kid in different directions, saying, "Well, here's what you should do."
Okay. Well, I think we have a lot of material for another program. Juan Pablo, are you willing to join us?
Yeah, absolutely. This has been great.
Okay. All right.
Well, thanks everybody again for listening. Dr. Pino, thank you. Of course, Mr. Teacher Man, Juan Pablo. And we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you,
Take care.
guys. Take care.
Thanks.